Pacific dreaming.
There we go. Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to GI's seminar today. It's a pleasure to see the diverse backgrounds of participants who have registered for today's seminar. We're joined by senior government officials, scholars, and researchers from multiple countries, consultants, and some students as well. This shows the wide interest in today's topic, unity and discord in the Pacific, negotiating the Pacific Agreement on Closer Economic Relations Plus. Let me have a quick introduction of today's speaker, Dr. Larry Crump first. We will have the Q&A at the end. Dr. Larry Crump is a senior fellow at the Griffith Asia Institute. Larry's research interests encompass bilateral, regional, and multilateral negotiations. His expertise has earned him recognition for groundbreaking research on negotiation theory and strategy, leading to numerous awards for his academic publications. In addition to his academic pursuits, he provides negotiation training to government and corporate entities, further demonstrating his commitment to the practical application of his research. His recent work focuses on the dynamic of negotiation involving Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific Island nations. PACER Plus represents a significant milestone in negotiation in the regional economic cooperation, though the negotiation process and its implementation haven't been without challenges. We are honored to have Larry present today, sharing his insights. Without further ado, let's start.
Well, I'm honored to be here. Thank you very much, Gloria, for that kind introduction. Gloria and I have been colleagues for over 20 years, I suppose. So that she should chair my seminar makes me really happy, I must say. I'd like to begin by thanking some people and organizations, and let me start by thanking the 46 people that kindly took some time out of their schedule to meet with me to be interviewed. And I couldn't have, would have been impossible to do the research that I did to publish the research report that's available on the Griffith Asia Institute's website if it hadn't been for their contribution. So I'm very grateful to them. I want to thank them first up. When I conducted this research, I was a member of the Griffith Asia Institute Pacific Hub. And I must say that I have to thank Keston Payne, who was here. She was invaluable in helping me with problems large and small in terms of not only the practicalities of getting around the Pacific, but actually doing the field research I needed to do, and even into writing the research report. So I'm very grateful to and specifically to Cass. I have to thank Caitlin, who of course was the director of the Griffith Asia Institute. When I first signed on, I pitched her the idea. I said, you know, I have this research funding and I'm retiring in 2021. I retired after 26 years at Griffith University. I thought I would hate to see this money sent back to Germany. It should be spent here to do research. And she kindly agreed to include me in the Griffith Asia Institute and introduced me to Tess. And then I guess I also need to thank Christoph, because he changed the nature of this, a paper I've never written like this before. I don't know that Griffith University would count it as giving me credit for it. But anyway, it was a paper that was basically, I was going to write a detailed case. Oftentimes I haven't written a case this detailed and since my PhD actually. So a very detailed case. And then I was going to summarize that case in a paper which I planned to write titled Strategy in Complex Negotiations. That was the plan. And Christoph arrived a year ago. He said, well, this is nice, but what did you learn from this? Are there any key takeaways? And what about an executive summary? And what about some advice to the governments that were involved in this? Let's have some maps and let's have some pictures. I said, okay, I'm retired. I can do this. I probably, if I'd still been employed, said, I don't have enough time. Thank you very much. I don't need to publish this paper. But I feel really good about the changes that he recommended. And I feel it's a really strong paper. I'm really pleased that I can present this to the Griffith Asia Institute. Finally, I'd like to thank the Center on Global Cooperation, which inspired this study and also funded this study. It's the Center for Global Cooperation Research. It's a little bit north of Dusseldorf in Germany. They, out of the, you know, how out of the blue you get an email, out of the blue I get an email, and I said, why don't you apply to be a research fellow at our research center? And they've got money. I'm like, other research institutes I've been affiliated with, they have money. I said, okay, let's talk about it. And well, the Center for Global Cooperation Research is interested in global things. I've done a fair amount of research. I've studied the GATT and the WTO negotiations, particularly around intellectual property. And I've studied the G20, and I've studied climate change negotiations. I've even studied the UN Security Council. I published papers on all of that. And so I said, I can go into that space and do something. But this was in 2016, and globalization was starting to appear, painted, the constraints of globalization was starting to appear. And I had just been appointed to be the deputy director of the Economic Studies Center at Griffith University. And so I said, you know, I don't really know. I know bilateral negotiations between nations. I know multilateral negotiation. I haven't studied anything regionally. So I pitched the idea that there is within globalization a space for regional associations. And they bought that and gave Griffith University $100,000 to support 3 research projects. And this is the third of those. The first one was in Latin America, the Pacific Alliance, that I studied four nations doing some very creative, innovative things. I figured I should spend some of the money in Europe, and so I studied the Union for the Mediterranean, which is 43 nations, all of Europe and North Africa, from Morocco to Israel. All of those countries have an association that was pretty functional then, but I'm not sure how functional it is now, given the things that are going on in Israel. And then the third one, and it was really an afterthought, is like, okay, the Pacific is close to Brisbane. I should easily be able to get there. Well, actually, it turns out it's not so easy to do, particularly after COVID. And so that was the third one I pitched to them. And they bought that. They accepted that idea. And so I thank the Center for Global Cooperation and Research for their inspiration and also their funding. I guess I might thank Griffith Business School, because for a lot of that research program, I was paid by Griffith Business School to conduct research. So that's kind of where this came from. And let me just kind of walk us through where we're going. I'm going to introduce you to the Pacific Rim and Closer Economic Relations, which is often known as PACER Plus. I'm going to introduce you to those negotiations. I'm going to talk a little bit about trade treaty negotiations as well, something that isn't in my research report, to kind of give you an introduction to 101 trade negotiations. And then I'm going to talk about parties and the interaction between the parties creates the structure. I'm going to talk about negotiation process, which is a very long section. I'll try to be brief because we've got 45 minutes. Negotiation outcomes, learning and key takeaways, and then some concluding observations, which includes some recommendations to the Australian and New Zealand government. And so that's where we're headed. And I'm just going to jump into talking about my field research. The first year, 2021 and early 2022, was a massive amount of literature on this particular study, but also just familiarizing myself with the Pacific. And then once I got into doing field research, I spent 10 days in Canberra. I spent a month in Fiji. Suva, of course, is the Geneva of the Pacific. And so you can go to Suva and meet with so many other Pacific Island countries, which is just great that they all kind of, not all of them, but many of them have an embassy or a high commission in Suva. I then spent about 10 days in Auckland and Wellington, and that was my field research. I succeeded to interview 14 of the 18 members of the Pacific Islands Forum, and it was the Pacific Islands Forum with the Secretariat in Suva, Fiji, that was the sponsor of this negotiation. And so I'm pretty pleased that I was able to visit so few places and get so many interviews from the representatives of so many countries. As I mentioned, I had 46 semi-structured interviews with government officials, diplomats, high commissioners, ambassadors, civil society, and the business community. And that included 35 face-to-face interviews and 11 online interviews. And that produced 146 pages of typed interview notes. I don't record because to put down a recording device in front of, you can do that in front of ambassadors and high commissioners. They aren't faced at all. But government officials are not often involved in, they are not allowed to speak to the media oftentimes. And so we put a recording device in front of them and it just shuts them up. And so I take notes furiously, trying to think of my next question as I'm taking notes. And I go home at night, and rather than going to the bars, I diligently type up my interview notes, is what I do. And so 146 pages of single space typed interview notes resulted in 38 themes. And some of those themes come out of negotiation, strategy, power, tactics, communication, such things. Some of them come out of the and the negotiation process. So just a quick overview of the process. I've got some other slides that will delve more quickly into the process. These negotiations began when the Pacific Island Forum leaders at an annual meeting, I believe that was in Cairns in August 2009, agreed to conduct the PACER Plus negotiations. They continued until June 2017, when the treaty was signed in Tonga, and then the ratification process begins. Anytime a nation negotiates a treaty, there's usually a ratification process. The treaty stipulated that once 8 nations had ratified the treaty, regardless of how many signed it, once 8 nations had ratified the treaty would enter into force 2 months later. And so in October 2020, the 8th nation had ratified the treaty, and then in December 2020, the treaty entered into force. So this isn't in my report, but I figured I should do a 101 on trade treaty negotiation. So a trade treaty negotiation is a pretty standard exercise. The great thing about negotiation is it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The end can be we reached an agreement or we didn't reach an agreement, and what happened. It's kind of a structured, cooperative, competitive decision-making exercise that structure allows it to be studied fairly easily because there's a lot of predictability in that. So we'll find trade in goods, and tariffs are the big issue in terms of trade in goods. And to reduce your tariffs, so you've got tariffs, say 40% on shirts, let's say, but you're going to do a special deal with the US where you're going to drop it down to 15%. Well, how do we know that those shirts actually came from America and didn't go from, say, China to America and then to Australia? Well, we have something called rules of origin. And there's different methods for determining that a good, particularly a good, not a service, a good originated from the country that you are giving essentially a tax discount to. And then there's, of course, customs and procedure, which involve rules of origin, but involve a whole bunch of other things. Sanitary and phytosanitary issues involve health and safety issues around plant and animal exports and imports. And so there's a whole range of things that need to be done so that a country that you've signed a treaty with, you would have a chapter that says you must meet these conditions if we're going to give you a reduced tariff and import your good. And so that chapter is pretty important to the health and safety of global society. Trade in services and movement of natural persons. And early on, I think it was my first trade negotiation involved Australia and Singapore. And I couldn't get my head around this idea, natural person. Why do you use the word natural person? They said, well, in fact, a long time ago, they defined organizations, corporations as people. And so to distinguish, and I'm sure, I've never studied that, but I'm sure that provides them with a certain amount of flexibility and certain benefits by a corporation being defined as a person. And so to distinguish a corporation from a human being, they use the word natural person. And so that intellectual property, which wasn't talked about in this particular trade treaty, but is oftentimes found. Investment, development, economic cooperation isn't always found. It is in this particular negotiation. And then labor and environmental issues. And the way that works is, sure, you can sell things at a cheaper price, but you're exploiting your labor or you're destroying your environment. And so they then create some conditions around the fact that, sure, you can sell things at a cheaper price. And you and I are negotiating a trade treaty, and we're going to give you a discount on a tariff, maybe give you 0 tariffs, but we would expect that certain labor conditions are met, certain environmental conditions are met. So that's kind of Trade Treaty 101. moving on, and this is a slide downloaded from the Pacific Islands Forum, and this is the members. It's sort of a new slide. It was sort of a new map. It wasn't there a year or so ago. One of the things that stands out is the concept that the Pacific Island Forum members adopted a few years ago, which was the hidden message is we're not a bunch of impoverished nations. What we are caretakers. We are the custodians of 20% of the world's land mass. So, they've got very large work. And I think that was a brilliant way to frame themselves. And they use that now consistently to say, we are the custodians. And they call themselves the Blue Continent. And so I like that particular map. But another map that gives another perspective, this is downloaded from Wikipedia. If you Google Pacific Islands, you'll get this. And you can see that there are 3 regions based on cultural and ethnic, both cultural and ethnic. We have Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia. We have, and the Pacific is a big concept. It'd be nice if we could narrow it and make it smaller. I lived on a Pacific Island in Alaska for a year, and well, it was a Pacific Island, and well, it would be really nice if we could call it the South Pacific. But if you look at where Kiribati is located, that's about where the equator is, and so you would cut out the Micronesians if we called it the South Pacific, because you would have to agree that the South Pacific must be south of the equator. So it's a pity that we can't find a more precise term to describe this region than the Pacific Islands, because that's a very large area. We're talking about the Pacific Islands that are in Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia. So here's some of the key characteristics that I've identified in terms of highlighting the differences between member characteristics. Australia with the largest population at 25 million. This is from the UN data 2020. NIWA at 1,626. I'm not sure they're actually defined as a nation. Tess, you would probably know that maybe they're a part of New Zealand, but Nauru is certainly defined. I think they have rights at the United Nations and at 10,000 citizens. What a difference from 25 million down to 10,000. I've also, since I'm studying a trade treaty negotiation, engagement with the WTO, and if there's a year next to their name, such as the ones on the left-hand side, then they are members of the WTO, and the year demonstrates the year they became members. On the right-hand side, these are not members. And the reason for that is because if you become a member of the WTO, it suggests something about your view towards your relationship to trade, your view towards engagement with international relations. And so it's a significant factor that whether you are a member or not a member. If I were studying, say, inclusiveness and economy, I'd probably add gender in there, because that's a quality that's important in terms of studying economic inclusiveness. I'm not studying that. I'm studying trade treaty negotiations. And so these are 2 important variables. Population serves as a proxy for gross domestic product, I suppose, which is another measurement I could have used. So those are the members of the key members of the Forum, the Pacific Islands Forum. So there are 18 primary parties that could have signed the treaty, but New Caledonia and French Polynesia were associate members for most of the negotiations, and they were never really involved and did not expect to be signing that treaty. But they have the legal right to sign that treaty, but of course they have a special relationship with France, and they would have to negotiate some things with France to do that. So there were 16 members, but Fiji was actually excluded. So that for much of the negotiations, there were only 15 members. Australia, New Zealand, and 13 island nations, because Fiji was excluded from 2009 to 2014. And the reason for that was because they had a bloodless coup. The leader of the military took over the Fiji government. Eventually, he became the prime minister. And because they had signed, and I don't know that I did the Takawa Declaration, how's my pronunciation test? Close enough. They had signed that in 2000, which suggested that committed all those island nations to good governance. And the argument that eventually emerged in the Pacific Island Forum is that a bloodless coup in democracies does not represent good governance. And it was on that condition that they eventually excluded Fiji. They postponed, not postponed, suspended. They suspended their membership. And the way that worked is they warned them, they said, let's work together, let's build a roadmap. And Fiji said, no, we're not ready to hold elections. And so they eventually held elections in 2014 on their own time. And so then Fiji became involved in the Pacific Islands and in the Pacific PACER Plus negotiations. So there's the Pacific Island Forum, which of course is the secretariat. They had some involvement, but Australia and New Zealand had created something called the Office of the Chief Trade Advisor, which served the Forum Island countries. It was set up in Vanuatu, and its purpose was to advise and assist the Pacific Island Forum members in conducting a negotiation. They lacked experience in that area, and Australia and New Zealand, though they funded that office, there were two of them that were hired consecutively, and they're very talented chief advisors to the Pacific Islands. But they also had some professional staff. And then there was civil society that was involved, the Pacific Network on Globalization, PANG, and the Pacific Island Association of Non-Governmental Organization, PIENGO. And these are headquartered in Suva, Fiji, where many international organizations are headquartered. And they were basically opposed to this. And the reasoning for their, I interviewed some of the members of those two organizations, and they explained to me, we're not against economic development, but we're against the kind of economic development that occurs through a trade treaty. And the reason for that is they argue that trade treaties move islanders out of the informal economy and into the formal economy, and the formal economy is not as resilient as the informal economy. And that was their logic for why they objected. And they were very active in, and I don't think Australia and New Zealand had ever been involved in a trade treaty negotiation. And they've both been involved in many trade treaty negotiations that had the level of civil society involvement and the level of civil society opposition. And so they had to, that was a challenge that believed it. Then we had the Pacific Islands Private Sector Organization, PIPSO, who was representing primarily the business community, and they were generally in support of the PACER Plus negotiation. So this is kind of the primary parties and the other parties. And so you would think that with 15, eventually 16, once Fiji got involved, that you might see this kind of framework. But oftentimes in multilateral negotiations, and I've studied quite a few, you don't actually see this for two reasons. If you had this kind of negotiation structure, this kind of networking structure, everybody's talking to everybody else, it creates so much complexity that it becomes difficult to manage the negotiations, number one. And number two, the other issue is that by building coalitions, you gain power. And so it's not at all unusual in global negotiations, you find on one side of the table representatives of developed countries, on the other side of the table you find representatives of developing countries. It's a very common pattern. Sometimes there's some other parties that become involved. They don't want to align with either side, but this is the standard. So on one side you had Australia and New Zealand, who oftentimes agreed on how to proceed with the negotiations. They, of course, disagreed privately. They didn't have negotiations and meetings, but they would arrive at a consensus. Sometimes one of the chief trade advisors would say to Australia, you know, your partner's not saying anything. What's that about? Which is the very toughest thing to say. Maybe there's some disagreement here between the two of them. And so they would try to do that sort of thing. And then on the other side, we have the Forum Island countries. The Forum Island countries, the word island countries means these are the islanders, that's excluding Australia and New Zealand from that concept. The Forum Island countries, in cooperation with OCTA, the Office of Chief Trade Advisor, who offered them substantial substantial support as the negotiations proceeded. Now you can find this very detailed process of negotiations on table 3, page 12. But let's just look at the table that I've provided in the executive summary. I might need my glasses to see this actually. So we've got, okay, PACER Plus negotiations began in August 2009. A tradition, and right away, what do they do? Well, it's probably Australia and New Zealand that established a traditional trade negotiation framework with priorities. And so they identify, these are the things we want to talk about in the next 2 or 3 years. And it looked very much, it had some similarity to the list of trade issues. They're defining it. So once you come together, you agree you're going to negotiate, you're going to establish an agenda. And so they were wanting to establish the traditional trade and development agenda that you would find in any WTO-based negotiation. Well, then, Chris Noonan, who he's the only one of 2 people that that I identify in my paper, because there's no way to not identify him. There were only 2 chief trade advisors, Chris Noonan and Edwin Kessel were the 2. And he comes in and he says, he's basically negotiating over what are we going to negotiate about? What is the agenda going to be? He said, yeah, it may be premature to start by talking about on this kind of traditional trade and development agenda. Why don't we start with some policy discussions? And why don't we engage in that sort of thing? Well, that didn't make Australia and New Zealand very happy, that he was questioning the agenda that they wanted to establish. And so, well, right before he resigns, he links together the issue that is most important to the Forum Island countries, labor mobility. There were some others, but he links labor mobility to trade in goods and services. He says, we will talk about trade in goods and services when we can also talk about labor mobility. And I guess that was the beginning of the end. When I interviewed Chris Noonan, he says he resigned for personal reasons. And when somebody says they resigned for personal reasons, well, you can't say, well, what were those personal reasons? They were personal. Other people that I talk with who have a view and were engaged in these negotiations on a daily basis feel that he was pushed out. And his life was just made difficult by Australia and New Zealand. So Edwin Kessel arrives in less than a year. What is that, about 9 months later? You know, there are plenty of talented, capable people in the trade field. But more than anything, that they should pick somebody out of the WTO and bring him in to be the chief trade advisor, says, we are going to negotiate our traditional trade and development agreement, is what that says. And so they proceeded, and everyone I talked to, except for civil society, had nothing but very positive things to say about Edwin Kessel. He is a brilliant, talented career diplomat based in Geneva, spent most of his life at the WTO, really talented fellow. And he offered great assistance to the Forum Island countries in managing this process. And so by 2016, there's a negotiation roadmap that's adopted. So we've got the agenda. Now, how are we going to achieve that agenda? Let's create kind of a timeline. What are we going to do now? And then what we'll do and what follows. And that's what we're doing. And so here it's been, this is the 4th year that negotiations have been going on. And you would expect at this point that they'd be moving towards conclusion instead of like building a roadmap. But basically, that linking together labor mobility with trading goods and services just presented an obstacle to Australia and New Zealand. They weren't backing down. And it was finally New Zealand that concluded that although they said publicly that we're making great progress, these negotiations were dead. And they were dead because there was no movement. The people in New Zealand said people were saying their lines at meetings and then they were doing nothing. Just saying their lines and moving on. There was no progress being made. There were no compromises, no concessions occurring. And so they talked about finding a solution. And the reason why Australia particularly, and partly New Zealand, was against including labor mobility is because Well, we have a chapter on the chapter on movement of natural persons, but that only includes professionals, typically. Executives, business people, professional people is what that includes. And we don't ever find trade treaties that include unskilled labor. And the Pacific Island foreign countries said that, well, they're just saying this, it's not important really. It actually was important to Australia, because they could easily imagine that if they had put in this trade treaty, that they would bring in through the trade treaty unskilled labor. You would have had China knocking on their door. You would have had Malaysia knocking on their door. You would have Thailand. You would have all these. They have trade treaties with these countries. Those trade treaties are reviewed every 3 to 5 years, and you can easily imagine say, "We want what you gave the Pacific Islands," and Australia and New Zealand didn't want to have that conversation. So New Zealand came up with this plan to create a separate agreement that was signed at the same time that the PACER Plus negotiation treaty was signed. That was not legally binding, but it was a matter of trusting us. And at first, the foreign island countries weren't sure if they could be trusted, but through a long set of discussions, they realized that it was better to have an agreement from people that you trust than a legal arrangement that may be implemented and may not be implemented. And so that deadlock was broken finally in June 2014. And so 2 years later, we've got almost so a great movement then occurs, a lot of activities occurring and the treaties are almost finished by September 2016. At that point, Papua New Guinea withdraws. When you first start to negotiate, you'd want to make a list of all the things you want and all the things you don't want to give the other side. And when Papua New Guinea was asked to conduct that, I was told by others who were around the table that Papua New Guinea had such a long list of things that they did not want to give that the other island nations said, "Why don't you just stop negotiating now if those are all the things you don't want to give?" And then I heard other people saying that Papua New Guinea wouldn't attend some meetings, or they would send junior staff to meetings. And so ultimately, Papua New Guinea figured out early on that they probably weren't going to participate in this treaty. Fiji, on the other hand, begins to become involved, and Fiji had 2 issues they wanted to address. They wanted to address the issue of infant industries. Infant industries are new industries. They wanted protection for new industries, or they wanted protection for companies that are moving into a new area. And the second issue, my notes. Most favored nation. I'm going to forget. Most favored nation. Most favored nation is the fundamental concept of most favored nation is that if I give a reduced tariff to you, and I have an agreement with someone else, I have to give it to them as well. And that's the whole concept of when you initiate a treaty, you give most favored nation status, and Fiji did not want that included in the trade treaty, which is just such a fundamental principle in trade treaty negotiations. It is the first principle in the GATT. If you go to the GATT website, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, you find that as the first principle. And so they didn't want to include that. And Fiji didn't back down, and Australia and New Zealand didn't back down. And so finally, Australia said, "We're finished, it's over." And Fiji then made a press release that said, "Wait a minute, we're being excluded." And they said, "No, you had your chance." And so the negotiation ended in April 2017, and the treaty was signed in Tonga in June 2017. It was signed by 11 of the 16 parties eventually. And then PACER Plus entered into force in 2020. So there's some external events so that's kind of the process between the parties. There's some other things going on that are worth noting. One of them being that Australia and New Zealand realized the Pacific Islands didn't have the knowledge they needed to effectively engage in trade treaty negotiations. And so they established the Pacific Islanders Trade Training Program, which was provided by the International Institute on Trade from the University of Adelaide, and that was 10 weeks, 50 days of training at some cost in Australia and New Zealand to provide that training on a whole range of trade negotiation issues. And then there's the annual non-state actor dialogue, which was sponsored by the Pacific Island Forum and the Office of the Advisors on Trade. And the annual non-state actor dialogue involved, this is how you involve civil society, you involve business, and those Pango and PIPSO were co-chairs of that. And so civil society and business was engaged. Pang was involved for a period of time, but they didn't find it very useful, and they were rather critical of their not being able to have their views heard in that forum. That was an annual, with the 7th occurring near the end. And then after you sign a treaty, you've got to ratify it. And if you're a large, complex organization, you'll have something like a parliament or a congress, and there'll be committee hearings and a process for the public to be involved. But if you're a small island nation, you probably are ruled by the prime minister or president, and a council would rule. And they would make decisions. But again, I think Australia and New Zealand realized if that's how the decisions were made this time, civil society would have objected to it. And so they created a readiness package to help them engage in consulting with the general public. For any countries that signed the treaty, there was money available to conduct public hearings. People were encouraged to attend those. They were asked for their comments. That was all recorded and documented, so that then when it went back to the council and a decision was made, it was based on information from the public. And that was something else that was part of the Australia and New Zealand system. So they created Pacific Islands Trade Training Program. They funded the Office of Chief Trade Advisor. They created something called the Readiness Package. And then finally, they created the Implementation Unit, which is currently housed in Samoa, which doesn't have anything to do with the negotiation or the ratification of the treaty, but is an important 4-part component. And I suggested in my paper that one of the things that might be useful for is that perhaps the US could learn some things from that framework in their negotiations in Latin America, and Europe could learn some things about that particular 4-part framework in their negotiations with Africa. Finally, there's Fiji, and well, there's some really interesting things that happened with Fiji. The first thing was they were excluded for much of the negotiations, and because they were excluded, well, eventually the Pacific Island Development Forum emerged, and it's not very active now. It's not doing much, but in the beginning, it was quite a surprise. And one of the most interesting things about the Pacific Island Development Forum is that at their initial organizing meeting in, I think it was 2013. Yeah, 2013, they had 300 delegates show up. 300 delegates showed up to this. Fiji got some funding from their business community. They got some funding from China. They got some funding from the UAE to hold this. They had, I believe it was five prime ministers or deputy prime ministers from the Pacific attended that. If it wasn't prime ministers or ministers, it was the senior officials that attended that particular meeting. They had a whole range of activities to try to create a islander-only trade and a development association. Who wasn't invited? Well, the US wasn't invited. Europe wasn't invited. China wasn't invited. Australia, New Zealand certainly not invited. So it's this effort of inclusion and exclusion that's going on. And I thought that was pretty interesting. And then the other thing that
what year was that?
I think that was 2013 when that occurred. And there's a couple of papers. There's a very good article in a book that I could direct you to that talks about that first meeting. And so one of the things I would like to point out to you is right there, if you look at, yeah, it was in 2013, because in 2014, after 4 years, and really they haven't accomplished anything, the second Pacific Island Development Forum meeting will occur 1 week after the breakthrough. And we didn't know, and the second meeting wasn't nearly as successful as the first meeting. But you can imagine the kind of questions that people are asking. Why aren't you accomplishing something with this PACER Plus negotiation? And in the back of your mind, you're thinking, well, gee, it's possible that this new association might emerge that excludes Australia and New Zealand from participating. And I would say that in the back of everybody's mind, particularly Australian New Zealanders, was in June 2014, when they knew that a week later there would be this second meeting, because the first meeting was such a success. And I think that had some impact on the decision, that the breakthrough that finally occurred. The other thing that was really interesting about Fiji is they went to the UN and got the Pacific Island Development Forum observer status. And that played a role in the Prime Minister, it played a role in Fiji being appointed as the president of UN COP23, which was held in Bonn in 2017. Here's this guy that's conducted a bloodless coup. And while the treaty's being signed in Tonga, he's in Bonn, welcoming everyone to Bonn for COP23. I think, what a power play. I was really impressed with. I mean, sometimes you don't attack someone directly. You kind of do things indirectly to gain power in another negotiation. So those were external events and actors that weren't at the table. Now, here's a kind of I thank Jill for producing this map. This comes from Griffith Asia Institute, and we've color coded it. And I'm not going to spend much time on it because I have another slide that captures it more clearly, but we've got the green countries that have signed and ratified the treaty. We've got the blue one, just Nauru signed but never ratified the treaty. We've got the countries that definitely wanted to join but then eventually couldn't join for reasons that I'll describe at the end. And we've got refused to sign. Of course, that's Papua New Guinea and Fiji. And then, of course, the countries, New Caledonia and French Polynesia, who weren't involved in negotiations. And this is a very interesting slide. There's a picture of Ed Weenie taking a picture of the delegates that were there to sign the treaty. And the most interesting thing about that picture is the number of flags that are sitting up there. And if you look carefully, you'll see there are 14 flags. And if you blow that up, you'll see that the Papua New Guinea flag and the Fiji flag are not present. But all the other flags are there. But in fact, as it turned out, we only got 62.5% of the people that are in countries that are inside PACER Plus, and 37.5% that are outside PACER Plus. That's of the 16, that's 6 countries that are outside and 10 that are inside. And well, that's it. So there's the treaty. It looks kind of similar to what I presented in the beginning. There's some initial things that are said in trade in goods, rules of origin, custom procedures, sanitary and phytosanitary, technical regulations, services, movement of natural persons, investment. You don't see intellectual property, development, economic cooperation. It was a trade and development treaty. And then final provisions where it mentioned that Tonga would serve as the depository of ratified treaties, and once 8 treaties were submitted, then it would go into effect. And so this is a fairly standard WTO trade and development framework, which is what Australia and New Zealand wanted from the beginning. Labor mobility, as I mentioned, was a separate agreement that was signed at the same time. So this is easier to understand than the map that I showed you a moment ago. Here's the countries that signed and ratified the treaty prior to it going into effect. Afterwards, we had Tuvalu and Vanuatu that ratified the treaty after it had entered into force. We had Nauru, who had signed the treaty but never ratified it. And I interviewed representatives of Nauru, and they said they don't expect they will ever ratify the treaty. They're not really interested in opening themselves up to international trade. The the reason we can say that the Federation of FMS, Marshall Islands and Palau, Federated States of Micronesia, I guess I wrote that, it should be FSM. The reason why we can say that they wanted to sign it and did not is because they negotiated the rules on tariffs. And if you've ever done that, it's a very painful, difficult process that involves a government, particularly if a government uses tariffs as a major source of their revenue. It's a very difficult thing to then say, well, how are we going to get our money if we're giving up all these tariffs, whether it be 1 year, 5 year, 20 years, or in some cases 30 years with PACER Plus. But still, eventually that revenue is going to be gone, and how are we going to replace it? And so it requires that you consult with industry or business. It requires that you consult internally, and they engaged in that. So we knew that they were committed to wanting to join PACER Plus, but they didn't. And the reason for that is because they have a relationship with America, and they're called the COFU, the 3 COFU countries, which I'll describe at the end of this presentation. And then, of course, Fiji and Papua New Guinea. So what are the learning and key takeaways? The 4-part Pacific Negotiation Skill Enhancement Program is quite unique. And it's something that, as I said, America could learn from that, Europe could learn from that. It's a very unique framework for working between developed and developing countries. And I think it serves as a model. It's quite impressive. Ongoing professional development, which involved these Pacific Islanders. Many of them hadn't ever engaged in trade treaty negotiations, so they're learning how to take positions, build arguments to defend their position, make compromises, build concessions. All that stuff could be seen as ongoing professional development. The problem is that it went on for too long. This was an 8-year negotiation, and it should have been a 4-year negotiation. And that's no big deal for Australia, New Zealand, that has plenty of money and plenty of manpower. But when you've got islanders that are trying to do their day job and engage in this negotiation, it was really quite unfair to the Pacific Island nation that it went on for so long. But the problem was that they weren't backing down on labor mobility, something I think Australia has finally realized they're benefiting from. New Zealand saw it long ago that they would benefit from that particular program. Practicing democracy, and that's the readiness package, not just the council making a decision, but actually going out into the community and asking, we want to hear your views. Let's have a forum. Let's answer questions. And so that's like practicing democracy. Power derived from unity and patience. The Pacific Island countries stood firm. Australia and New Zealand tried to break that unity and were unable to do that. Those countries that need a deal are more likely to compromise first, and the 4 other countries just patiently waited them out. So unity and patience is a very great source of power, regardless of whether you're a developed or a developing country. Actions in one venue can contribute to consequences in another venue. And I think Australia particularly engaged in things that very much alienated Fiji. And as a result of that, we see Fiji's lack of cooperation in the trade field. And then the influence of powerful parties not at the table. And that is particularly America, and I'll save that for a moment. I'm just going to, so here we have some short-term impacts. That's a great picture of labor mobility. What we have is Pacific Islanders tending to wineries in Australia is what that is. But we can talk about the short-term impacts in the Q&A, and then there's some long-term implications, which I have designed a study, which would be great for a PhD student's thesis if they wanted to do that. Not now, probably in 15 to 20 years, this particular study could be done where it would allow us to see what impact PACER Plus actually had. I've identified PACER Plus members and PACER Plus non-members. All of these are not WTO members, which would serve as an intervening variable. And then we can talk about this as well in Q&A if you want. I spent some time thinking about the 2050 strategy on the Blue Pacific continent, which is a document that was created a few years ago. I looked at their implementation plan, and then I looked at how PACER Plus might support or not support their implementation plan. Finally, and this is my last slide pretty much, some concluding observations. It's at the end of my report, where I offer some recommendations to Australia and New Zealand. It turns out that the PACER Plus was established under Kevin Rudd's administration. And it seems to me that Kevin Rudd now sits as the ambassador for the US from Australia. And I cannot help but wonder if those three compact countries that have a special relationship to Australia, each of them, there's not like one treaty, that each of them have a separate treaty. The Confederate States of Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, and Palau each have a special treaty with the U.S. that allows them things like labor mobility. Islanders can go to the U.S. and work, and there's other benefits that are. And when I talked to the people of these countries, they said to me the reason they wanted to join PACER Plus was not because they figured they could do business with America or New Zealand. They figured it would help them in doing business with the U.S., which I thought was kind of interesting. And so these three countries came together at the very end. They did submit their tariff schedule. They did appear to sign the treaty. And they wrote to the U.S. a letter, and they said, we would like to join this treaty. We have some concerns. That their treaty with the U.S. requires them to inform the U.S. And so they informed the U.S. And I was told two different stories. I think both of them are true. They never heard back from that letter. That's the informal response, no response. But the informal response is they were advised not to join PACER Plus. And I can't understand why the U.S. government would object to these three island nations engaging in what is essentially a trade and development WTO-style treaty that would bring unity to the Pacific. And I think that Australia should go back to the three compact countries and ask if they're still interested. And if they are still interested, then they should make representations to the U.S. Of course, back in 2017, after all the treaty was signed, the DFAT asked their ambassador, Joe Hockey, I believe it was, to speak to the U.S., but nothing came of it. But things have changed a lot since 2017 to 2024. And I think the U.S. might be more amenable, and I think it would be nice. And if these countries still want to join PACER Plus, they can include it. So anyway, that's the conclusion to my research report, and thank you for your patience and attention.